Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to DIY with Rye. Today I'm going to show you how I made this coffee table out of dimensional lumber. A few weeks ago, a friend of mine approached me about building him a new coffee table after the one he had kind of fell apart. He gave me some rough ideas as far as the dimensions and the color that he was looking for, but otherwise he left it up to me to create the design. So, I began by cutting down 4x4 posts to create the legs and lower frame rails of the table. Since the miter saw that I have only has a cut depth of 3.5 inches, it took 2 passes to cut all the way through the posts. Once the legs and lower frame rails were cut, I moved on to cutting the 1x10 boards that would make up the tabletop and lower shelf. Having a sliding miter saw would really help here, but since I don't, I just made the cut in 2 passes. Again, and again, and again. Finally, I cut down some 2x6s to make up the upper frame and tabletop border. Over at the table saw, I proceeded to get the boards cut to their final sizes. Starting again with the legs, I made a cut at 2 inches by raising the blade to its max height and slowly guiding the board through. Even at its highest setting, I still needed to do 2 passes in order to cut through the wood. In following the design, I left the fence where it was and continued to cut down the lower frame rails to size, following the same techniques as I did with the legs. At this point, I noticed sawdust was starting to float past me like light snow, so I knew it was time to open the garage for at least some ventilation. After a minor cleanup break, I continued on with the build. Here I am adding a 1-inch rabbet to the inner edge of the lower frame for the lower shelf to sit on. Now finally, all that was left to do was to cut the shelf pieces down just enough for them to fit. Moving on to the assembly, I began by building each end frame using glue and pocket hole screws. A helpful trick I've picked up on when using pocket hole screws is to apply some clamping pressure while driving each screw in order to avoid the piece you're trying to attach from wandering. Now, originally I did plan to use glue and dowels as the joinery method on this table, but I found it a little tricky to line up the dowels on the lower frame rails. If you do try something like this for yourself, and you're a beginner like me, glue and pocket hole screws will do just fine. Once each end frame was assembled, I stood them both up on end and spaced them out in order to attach the side rails. This part was definitely a little tricky since I didn't have a large enough clamp expand the width of the table frame. I ended up just brute forcing it. In hindsight though, I definitely could have tried clamping the end frames to the workbench as a workaround, but as far as I can tell, this worked out just fine. Now after getting the top rail on, I kind of awkwardly flipped the table frame over in order to attach the bottom rail. Moving on to the tabletop, I wanted to go for a picture frame type of look. So I gave my first shot at mitered corners, and overall I was quite pleased. Still some learning to do, but we'll get there. Anyways, after making the cuts, I lightly sanded down the joints in order to get a tight fit because my miter saw is not super exact. Now, to join the tabletop frame together, I gave another attempt at the dowels. First, drawing 2 lines across each joint, I lined up the jig and drilled in the holes. This part went together a lot better than my previous attempt when I was working on the frame. And now for everyone's favorite, sanding. And yeah, more sanding. No, it's not really that bad, and actually it's a little bit meditative. One note, I actually began the sanding process before attaching the tabletop, as it allowed me to reach around the entire table a lot easier. To get the dark wood look my friend was after, I ended up staining the table with a coat of Varathane Walnut stain. I wasn't really planning to go for a rustic look for this table, which is kind of what I thought might happen since I'm staining soft wood, but it actually turned out a lot better than I expected and wasn't really all that rustic. And finally, the moment we've been waiting for, attaching that tabletop. Now, be smarter than I was and ask for a hand when attaching something like this. It ended up taking me 2 tries to get it right, as the alignment pegs I added only really fit one way. But once it was on, I added as many clamps as I could to get it securely attached. After that, the last part was to add 2 coats of polyurethane to all the areas that could see at least people touching it. I didn't waste my time covering the entire table as A, it would have taken quite a while to do, and B, most furniture makers in general don't add polyurethane to every nook and cranny. They just add it to the high touch areas. So that's what I went with for this table, and it worked out well. Alright, and there you go, the finished table. Overall, I am incredibly happy with how this turned out, and I know my friend will be too. Let me know down in the comments what you think, any recommendations on what you would do differently, or if this inspired you to try making something for yourself. But that'll do it for this one. Be sure to subscribe and stay tuned for more project videos like this. Till next time.